طيب. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله وصلى الله وسلم على خير خلق أجمعين نبينا Muhammad وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ثم أما بعد. We begin as we should and as we always do by praising and glorifying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, saying and articulating our gratitude and appreciation to Him. First and foremost, praising Him because of His grandeur and His most beautiful and excellent names and His exquisite attributes. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the exalted and sublime, the most high, and that He deserves to be praised in all times, and that all praise belongs to Him, simply because of who He is. But before He's done anything for you, but simply because who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. That He is Al-Khaliq, Al-Raziq, Al-Wadud, Al-Rahman, Al-Ghafur, Al-Ghaffar, Al-Razaq. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Al-Muta'al. But then, of course, we show gratitude and appreciation to Him because what He has done for us and the blessings that we are continually and always experiencing in our lives, in every moment, every second, that are incalculable, innumerable. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, وَإِن تَعُدُّوا نِعْمَةَ اللَّهِ لَا تُحْصُوهَا. And if you were to try to calculate and enumerate all of the different blessings that you experience in your life, it would not be possible to do so. How can you possibly thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for every single liter of blood running through your veins, right? From the time of your birth until your death. How could you possibly thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for every moment that you have eyesight, every breath that you've taken? It's not possible, let alone all of the actual blessings, the money in your bank account, the clothes on your back, the home over the roof over your head. It's not possible to thank for everything, right? No matter what your circumstance or situation. And yet, nonetheless, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us to be grateful and appreciative to Him. And so in our humble way, we try as best we can to show our appreciation and gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And not only this, but we send our peace and blessings upon the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant him the maqam al-mahmud, the honored and noble station that is there for him, that he promised for the Prophet alayhi salatu salam. And not only this, but we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless the household and the family of the Prophet alayhi salatu salam, his wives, our mothers, his children, those from amongst his family who embraced Islam. And not only this, but the companions of the Prophet alayhi salatu salam, his disciples. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with them as they are pleased with him. At the helm, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, Umar ibn Khattab, Uthman ibn Affan, Dhul Nurayn, and Ali ibn Abi Talib, radiyallahu anhum ajma'een, and all of the companions. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with them. May He grant them high stations and status. May He allow us to follow in their footsteps and their examples of their following and being disciples of the Prophet alayhi salatu salam. Allahumma ameen. So, inshallah, we're continuing with our Sirah of the Prophet alayhi salatu salam, namely using the vehicle and the poem by Ali ibn Al-Izz Al-Hanafi, Ibn Abi Al-Izz Al-Hanafi, Al-Arjuza Al-Mi'iyya fi dhikri hali ashraf al-bariyya, the 100-line poem in the remembrance of and the biography of the most noble and the greatest of mankind, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we're going to pick up where we left off from last week in lines 3 through 5. Inshallah, we were talking about the birth of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and more specifically, the birth date of the Prophet alayhi salatu salam. And then what we'll be covering today, aside from that, is the passing or the death of the father of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the wet nurse, the mother by way of suckling Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the splitting of his chest. This is one of the major events that occur in the life of the Prophet alayhi salatu salam on multiple occasions. The passing of the mother of the Prophet alayhi salatu salam, the death of his mother, Amina bint Wahab, and then also the passing of the paternal grandfather of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, meaning the grandfather from his father's side. right? And if you're following along in the book, the Sharh by Sheikh Abdul Razak Al-Abad Al-Badr, it is essentially covering pages 51, alaikum salam wa barakatuh, pages 51 through 71. That's what we're going to be covering. Now, just a reminder, we're not going to be covering every single thing that the Sheikh who's explaining the book, Sheikh Abdul Razak, not going to cover every point that he covers through there, but yani ru'us al-aqlam, yani the main points, inshallah. طيب. So, before we do that, I want to ask some questions, making sure that everybody's, or at least some of us, are following along, inshallah ta'ala. I already mentioned it, but what is the name of the author of the book, of the poem? Naam Habibi. He's most commonly known as Ibn Abi al-Izz al-Hanafi. Naam. طيب. And then also, what is the meaning of Mukhtar? What is the meaning of Mukhtar? And we covered this last week. Mukhtar. Huh? The chosen one, right? And this is referring to who? Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. طيب. Also, what did we say about the word or the term Al-Qadim? Al-Qadim, what does it mean? And what did we say about it? And to give you a clue, in reference to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Qadim. In the beginning of the poem, it starts out, Alhamdulillahi Al-Qadim Al-Bari. Alhamdulillahi Al-Qadim Al-Bari. Thumma salatuhu ala al-Mukhtari. Yes. It's not permissible to say it at all. So, okay. Ancient, eternal, but go ahead, brother. Naam, jazakallah khair. Well, go ahead.
You can call him by that name, but it's not actually a name of Allah.
Mm-hmm.
You can say it like referencing kind of.
So you can use the term speaking about Allah, but you cannot say that that is His name, right? You can speak, right? And that's what it means by Bab al-Khabar, meaning information. You're talking about Allah, but you can't say, right? Y'all ever heard that nasheed? Huwa Allahu alladhi la ilaha illa huwa. You know what I'm talking about? The one that says all the names and attributes of Allah, right? So in there, they try to use only from the Quran and the Sunnah. You could not include in there Al-Qadim. That's not one of the names of Allah from the Quran or from the Sunnah. That's what it means. It's not mentioned in there. So thus, you can't say it's one of His names. All right, tell you. But when talking about Allah, you can't use it. Okay. Then what did we say? Al-Qadir means. Go ahead. Al-Qadir. That He does all. Right, in reference to His power, that Allah is able to do all things. There's nothing that can stop Him. Right? Now, that He is Al-Qadir. He is able to do whatever He wants, whenever He wants. Right? And then what about Al-Bari? Or I'm sorry, and is Al-Qadir, is that one of His names? Okay, so yes, طيب. So if somebody wanted to be named Abdul Qadir, you can say that, right? Now, طيب, Al-Bari. Now, the originator, right? Meaning that He brings things from non-existence into existence, or He creates them and makes them, right? طيب. خلاص. So we're going to go ahead and start now. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So the last thing we were talking about is the birth of the Prophet ﷺ. What year was the Prophet ﷺ born? Huh? Am al-Fil, the year of the elephant, which is mentioned in the Quran. And I believe I did not mention last week, like, when exactly in relation to that event was the Prophet ﷺ born? Was he born like 6 months after that, but it's still the year of the elephant? Was it 2 weeks after that event and it's still the year of the elephant? Like, when was it? So most scholars say it was about 50 days after that event occurred. 50 days after that event occurred that the Prophet ﷺ was born, alayhi salatu salam. Tayyib. Okay, so we know it's the year of the elephant, right? And then, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. And which day was the Prophet ﷺ born? He was born on a Monday, and that's mentioned in numerous places. So, for example, in Sahih Muslim, Abu Qatada al-Ansari, radiallahu anhu, he mentions that the Prophet ﷺ was asked, "Why do you fast on Mondays? What's up with that?" Right? And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Dhaka yawmun wulidtu," right? That's the day that I was born. That's the day that and the Quran was sent. That I yani bu'ithtu fi. That was the year that I was commissioned as a prophet, and wa unzila alay, and that is the year that Quran was sent down and revealed to me, right? So we have from the Prophet ﷺ himself telling us it was a Monday, right? And the Sheikh in the poem, he says Rabi' al-Awwal, right? Now, the last thing that we mentioned and where we stopped about the date is when the date is that the Prophet ﷺ was born. We got the year, we got the day, we got the month, Rabi' al-Awwal. But the date, was it the 20th, the 22nd, the 13th, the 12th? What was the last thing we said about that? Or was the last thing that was mentioned about that? He was born on a few different dates? They didn't? None of them said a single day? Two or three options? Okay, you're almost there, but just, it's not that each scholar said, yeah, it's about 3 or 4 different days, maybe. But some said this day, some said this day, some said this day, and going right different up to almost like 10 different opinions. So these different scholars disagreed, as opposed to saying like some said, yeah, maybe it was this one, maybe it was this one, maybe it was this one, right? Right. There's no agreement. They differ, right? So I just want to share with you with Sheikh Al-Bani rahimahullah what he mentions with this regards, right? And something that Sheikh Abdul Razak Al-Abad Al-Badr mentions, hafidhahullah. طيب. So Sheikh Al-Bani rahimahullah, he says, and this is mentioned in his Sahih Sirah. So Sheikh Al-Bani rahimahullah, who was a notable hadith scholar, right? He was a scholar in numerous sciences, but he was particularly known as a muhaddith, specializing in the various different Islamic sciences of hadith, right? And grading a hadith, are they authentic or not? And he has a book of Sirah where he goes through it and only brings narrations that are authentic. That's it, right? So any stories that have no chain of transmission or narration, there's no sanad, like where did it come from? Where does this story come from? Or where did this event occur? Like who said it? If that's not there, he doesn't bring it in his book. He only brings a collection of authentic narrations related to the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. And it's called Sirah, Sahih as-Sirah. Anyways, he says, in the month of the Prophet ﷺ's birth, there are statements in Ibn Kathir's book, Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya, the beginning and the end. He said that are attributed to the birth of the Prophet ﷺ, yet none of them have chain of narrators. None of them have a chain of narrators. So this one would say he was born on this day, another one would say that on this day, but where did they get that from? None of them mention, right? This is what Ibn Kathir, he says, rahimahullah. He says it's possible to analyze them and weigh them against the science of hadith terminology. When doing so, we find only one statement. We find only one statement mentioning surely his birth was on the 8th of Rabi al-Awwal. And Malik ibn Anas, the notable scholar known as the Imam Darul Hijrah, the Imam of essentially Medina, he has a important work known as the Muwatta, Al-Muwatta, which is a collection of hadith. So similar to Musnad Imam Ahmed, Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, Sunan Ibn Majah, Imam Malik rahimahullah, he has a very important work known as Muwatta. He also has that in his book, this statement. And others report it with a chain of narrators that is sahih on the authority of Muhammad ibn Jubair ibn Mut'im, who is second generation, meaning he's a tabi'i. Perhaps the Islamic historians grade this statement as sahih, relying heavily upon it. Yet the majority of the scholars still state that it's on the 12th, and Allah knows best. Right? Tayyib. My point though is that what? He says there's only one that has a chain of narration, that's an authentic sanad. And what day is it say for? Or the date? What date? For the 8th, which is contrary to the popular opinion, which is what? The 12th. Right? But even then, it's still not a smoking gun, so to speak. So the last thing, Sheikh Al-Arjuza Al-Mi'iyya, he mentions, anyone who claims he is absolutely certain about a specific day in the month of Rabi' al-Awwal in which the Prophet ﷺ was born has no clear-cut proof to that claim. Right? No. The point is what? The conclusion from this is that the exact date, is it the 12th? Is it the 10th? Is it the 11th? Is it in Ramadan? Right? Well, not Ramadan. We'll leave that one off. But the different dates within Rabi' al-Awwal, nobody has a clear-cut answer with an authentic chain of transmission, either from the Prophet ﷺ himself or his companions or otherwise. So that means, right, practically, things like, for example, when the question comes up about celebrating the birthday of the Prophet ﷺ, right? Speaking not in terms of is it a bid'ah or is it something legislated, but simply logically, can you even do that if you don't even know? According to scholars, experts in that field, they don't even agree when he was born, let alone, which is even more important, is it something even legislated in Islam? Should we or should we not be celebrating the birthday of the Prophet ﷺ? So that's why that's important to know. So, in conclusion, we know the day or the year, we know the month, we know the day, but we don't know the date when the Prophet ﷺ was born. طيب. طيب, and the last thing I'll mention with this regards, that hadith, about Monday. So we said the Prophet ﷺ, he mentions, right? ذاك يوم ولدت فيه وبعثت فيه أو أنزل علي فيه. This is the day on which I was born, the day on which I was sent as a messenger, and the day on which I was received revelation. So there's some other things significant about Monday too. Not only was the Prophet ﷺ born on that day, not only did he receive revelation, but also when he migrated from Mecca to Medina, it was also on Monday. And when he arrived in Medina, it was also on a Monday. And the day that the Prophet ﷺ passed away, it was also on a Monday, right? And all those things that I just mentioned, right, about when he leaves for Medina, when he arrived in Medina, and when he passed away, being on a Monday, all that's going to come later on again in the poem itself. So ووافق العشرين من نيسان. This is the next line in the poem, which means it corresponds, the day that he was born, it corresponds with Nisan, which essentially means that he was born in April. Nisan is the another word for the month of April. And that's according to scholars of mathematics and the stars or whatever, and mapping calendars, right? That it would equate to that. طيب. وَقَبْلَهُ حَيْنُ أَبِيهِ حَانَ. So those last two parts. وَوَافَقَ الْعِشْرِينَ مِنْ نَيْسَانَ وَقَبْلَهُ حَيْنُ أَبِيهِ حَانَ. If I'm not mistaken, that's the fifth line couplet, right? So that's the last part. And before him, his father passed away. And what they mean before him, they mean before the Prophet ﷺ was born. The Shaykh, he means before the Prophet ﷺ was born, his father passed away, i.e. the Prophet ﷺ's father died before he was even born. Prophet ﷺ never met his father. right? And there are some difference of opinion with that regards, but what seems to be the most correct opinion when he before he was even born, right? And this is even according to Ibn Ishaq, which is one of the most important works of the Sirah of the Prophet ﷺ, and one of the most earliest. So you're going to hear that book referenced, Ibn Ishaq, right? It's one of the most important works in Sirah. Matter of fact, any contemporary book in Sirah that is written after, more often than not, they are going to reference that, right? Ibn Ishaq, Al-Waqidi, Ibn Sa'd, Ibn Hisham, they will reference those ones. But you're going to hear over and over again, Ibn Ishaq. And he says, for sure, before the Prophet ﷺ was born. طيب. So now we're on lines 6 and 7. طيب. قال المصنف رحمه الله نفعنا وإياه بعلمه في الدارين اللهم آمين. وبعد عامين غدا فطيمة جاءت به مرضعه سليمة حليمة لأمه وعادت به لأهلها كما أرادت. Right? So line number 6, and he was weaned after 2 years by his wet nurse Halimah, who then brought him home healthy, safe and sound. To his mother, right? She returned him to his family, right? Just the way they wanted him to be, just the way that they wanted or desired. And so what is meant here? وَبَعْدَ عَامَيْنِ غَدَى فَطِيمَةً جَاءَتْ بِهِ مُرْضِعُهُ سَلِيمًا. So the habit of the Arabs, and in particular those who were either nominally wealthy or wealthy, what they would typically do with their children, right, when they're first born, is they would send them out to the Badia, right, out to the deserts and to live with different tribes and families that were that they themselves had, babies that were suckling, and they would send them out to live with them, right? And the reason for this is, I need to strengthen their bodies because of the environment. It's, the air is cleaner out there because it's away from the city where it's more densely populated, you know what I'm saying, and pollution and stuff like that. But then also for them to kind of learn the ways and the habits and the customs of the Arabs, who are, again, they're isolated out there, with themselves and not mixing with other people who are coming from different areas and places to do business and so on. And so they end up learning their ways, their habits, and their customs, right, when they're living out there in the Badia. And again, when we say it's strong, get for them to be stronger, like obviously if they're helping taking care of animals, like think of, if y'all, imagine like farm life here, right? Got to wake up early in the morning, got to, feed the animals, got to look after them. You got to, what I'm saying? You got to do all of these different things, responsibilities. Nobody's lounging around. Everybody's got to pitch in and help. It's similar or akin to that. You're out there, you're taking care of whether it's goats, camels, sheep, whatever, right? They got to help. Then not only that, if you're out there, you're going to be oftentimes by yourself, right? Because you're going to have to, like a kid is going to have to take out the herd, right? Whether it's a herd of sheep or a herd of goats, and they're going to have to go out. And where are they going to go? Wherever there's food for their animals. So if there's not food right next to them, then they're going to have to walk, go off on their own. And of course, when they're out there on their own, they have to protect and fend for those animals, right? Their sheep or their goats or whatever, and fend them off from what? From wolves, from lions, and from anybody that might try to attack it. So obviously, long story short, it's like a different lifestyle. That's what they want for their kids. And up until this day, until now, people still practice that now. What's the term when they send kids like back home? Is it ducking the Is that the term? Right. That's usually what? Oh, because it's so bad here in America, they got caught up and stuff like that. We need to get them back home so they learn the language, the culture, and right, and then they get a break, so to speak. Right. But as opposed to waiting until something bad happens, they do it like preemptively. So, when they would do this, what specifically happened with the Prophet ﷺ? So there's actually it's narrated by Halimah bint Abi Dhu'ayb, a Sa'diyah herself, the wet nurse i.e. the mother of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, she actually tells that we came this particular year, the year that they came to take look for children, and they would come, all of the different tribes out there, they'd come into the city, into Mecca, looking for families who have newborns that they could take, and then they would go back for a year or two, and then they would get paid for that. All right. So on this particular year that they came, Halima bin Sa'diyah, she's relatively poor, right? Not relative. She's extremely poor, right? Her camel is broken down. Her animal doesn't provide any milk, right? She mentions herself that me and my husband, we used to go to sleep hungry every night, right? I barely ever have anything, if anything at all, to breastfeed my own kids, right? So they're really counting on getting a baby when they come in, right? So everybody's going throughout Mecca. They're looking for babies, and all the other women in the families are getting babies. They would stop by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they would find that his father is what? So they're looking at it like, well, if his father's dead, who's going to pay us? Right? He's the head of the household. Like, who's going to pay us? So everybody is like, nah, we're good. Nah, we don't want him. And there might be somebody out there somebody want to check on. Okay. So nobody wants to take him. Halimah bin Sa'diyah, she also goes to him, notices that there's no father. She's like, nah, I'm good. Come the end of the day, everybody got a baby except her. So her husband's like, well, what about a baby that you went to before? So she goes back to Amina bint Wahab, the mother of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and she takes him. Now, I mentioned already, right, that her camel and her riding mount is the slowest out of everybody's, right? And her animals, they don't have no milk, right? The goat that they have ain't producing any milk, nothing. And the night before, they go to sleep hungry, baby's crying. She said, but once we got this baby, though, all of a sudden, my riding mount, which normally I was trailing behind everybody, was all of a sudden spry, has an extra step, and now we're in front of everybody. And everybody's like, what's going on? What then happened to your animal? I don't know. Then when it comes time for them to eat, she's like, the udder, right, where they get the milk from the camel, they're like, it's full. When normally it's like barren and dry. She was like, it's so full, me and my husband, not only are we not get to drink some, she's like, we get to drink our fill, which we never get to do. We always would go to sleep hungry. She's like, no, we get to drink, both of us get to drink our fill. And of course, because she gets to drink her fill, that means the what? Now she can feed the babies and they're not going to go hungry, right? So so she takes care of, now it's not that she takes care of, but now she's experienced a great deal of barakah, right? And both her and her husband, right, attribute and recognize it to the presence of this little boy in their presence now, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And right, وَبَعْدَ عَامَيْنِ غَدَى فَطِيمَةٌ جَاءَتْ بِهِ مُرْضِعٌ سَلِيمًا. So she kept him for 2 years. She kept him for 2 years, right? And when he says غَدَى فَطِيمَةٌ, meaning that she kept him until the typical period where you would wean a baby off of drinking and now they start eating food, right? And this is mentioned in the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah, ayah number 233, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, بَعْدَ أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ وَالْوَالِدَاتُ يُرْضِعْنَ أَوْلَادَهُنَّ حَوْلَيْنِ كَامِلَيْنِ لِمَنْ أَرَادَ أَنْ يُتِمَّ رِضَاعَهُ. Right? The mothers, they give suckling to their children and feed their children for 2 years, right? And that is for the parents who desire to complete the whole term, the 2 years. So Ghada Fatima, that's what she did. She kept him for 2 years, and then when it's time to wean him off and he can start eating now, she brought him back just the way his family wished and wanted, right? No. However, وَعَادَتْ بِأَهْلِهَا, right? And she, Halima, returned him to the family, but when she did, because they were experiencing so many blessings, so much barakah in their life, right? From their animals, their food, and just in every which way, she convinced the Prophet ﷺ's mom, Amina bint Wahab, let me take him back, right? You know, look at it, he's still 2 years old, he's still too young, right? Let him come back with me, you know, that way he'll still be even stronger when he comes back to you, and he'll be even, you know, more fit, healthier, or whatever. And they agreed. His mother agreed, and they sent him back for another 2 years. And I almost forgot to also, like, when there's a lot of people concentrated like that too, I mean, aside from pollution or whatever, like sicknesses and diseases spreading, right? If y'all remember, like when COVID was happening, what did they want us to do? They wanted us to like separate and get away from each other, because then diseases are less likely to spread. Same thing. They were like, that's what she used to convince them. Like, man, if he goes there, all the people gonna be there. Just let him come and stay with us. No. And so now we're in line number 8. Line number 8. Right? فَبَعْدَ شَهْرَيْنِ شِقَاقُ بَطْنِهِ وَقِيلَ بَعْدَ أَرْبَعٍ مِنْ سِنِّهِ. So after 2 months, his stomach was split open. Some say after he was 4 years old. So now this is, again, a major event in the life of the Prophet ﷺ, where once he returned back, no. And if you've ever seen an autopsy or whatever, akhi, when they're coming here, even when they're going for the heart, they start from the sternum, right? And they go all the way down to the belly button, because they got to do like this, right? So it's actually from the chest all the way to the stomach, right? Now, tell you, yeah. So he says either it was 2 months after they returned, which would mean he was how old? No. Look it. She had him for 2 years and then brought him back, convinced her to allow him to take him for a little bit longer. And then it says after 2 months. وَبَعْدَ شَهْرَيْنِ. So how old is he? He's 2 years and 2 months, right? وَقِيلَ بَعْدَ أَرْبَعٍ مِنْ سِنِّهِ. So he's alluding to, or saying, that there's difference of opinion. Some who say it was 2 months after he came back, he was only 2 years and 2 months, and others say that it was when he was 4 years old, right? طيب. And this is what is narrated by Ibn Ishaq. Here's that name again, all right? When the Prophet ﷺ, he was asked, tell us about yourself, right? They said, oh, Messenger of Allah, tell us about yourself, right? So then when you hear this, that means this narration has more weight, because it's the Prophet ﷺ telling you about himself as opposed to someone else saying about him, right? What he said, نعم أنا دعوة أبي إبراهيم وبشرى أخي عيسى ورأت أمي حين حملت بي أنه خرج منها نور أضاء له قصور الشام واسترضعت في بني سعد بن بكر فبين أنا مع أخ لي خلف بيوتنا نرعى بهما لنا إذ أتاني رجلان عليهما ثياب بيض بطسط من ذهب مملوء ثلجا فأخذاني فشق بطني واستخرج قلبي فشقاه فاستخرج منه علقة سوداء فطرحها ثم غسل قلبي وبطني بذلك الثلج حتى أنقياه ثم أحدهما لصاحبه زنه ب10 من أمته فوزني بهم فوزنتهم ثم قال زنه ب100 من أمته فوزنني بهم فوزنتهم ثم قال زنه ب1000 من أمتي فوزنني بهم فوزنتهم فقال دعه عنك فوالله لو وزنته بأمته لوزنها. So his response, or him answering and telling about himself, he said, yes, I am the supplication of my father Ibrahim alayhi salam, and the glad tidings of my brother Isa alayhi salam. My mother saw light illuminating the castles of Sham when she was pregnant with me. I was suckled in the house of Banu Sa'ad bin Bakr. One time, and that's the tribe of Halimah bin Sa'diyah, right? Sa'ad bin Bakr. He said, one time my brother and I were playing behind our house, tending to our sheep, when two men wearing white garments came to us with a gold basin. They came with this gold, like large dish, right? Filled with ice. And in other narrations, it says with Zamzam water. So they grabbed me and laid me down and opened my stomach and took out my heart. They cut open my heart and took out a black blood clot and threw it away. Then they washed my heart and my stomach with it, yani his insides, with ice until it was clean. Then one of them said to the other, balance him with 10 people from his ummah. And so he made me equivalent to them. So when he waited, right, the Prophet ﷺ was equal to 10. And he said, okay, then with 100 people from his ummah. And then it was equivalent. And then he said with 1,000 from his ummah. And then still again, it was equivalent. So he said, leave him. For by Allah, if you were to balance him with his ummah, yani the entirety of his ummah, right, then it would have, then he would have been equivalent to them. So this narration has a strong chain of transmission as according to Ibn Kathir. And this is the last one that I'll mention about that and then explain. So now there's another narration where Anas ibn Malik, and this is in Sahih Muslim, where Anas radiallahu anhu, he says that the Prophet ﷺ, the angel Jibreel alayhi salam came to him. So somebody might, and what we're going to read is similar, but it's not exactly the same. So a benefit here is like, what's the benefit of bringing different narrations of a singular hadith or event, right? Is that there may be details in one that are not in another. So when you bring them together, right, it becomes there, you get more clarity, right, because you have more details. All right. So anyways, so it's the same event, but now before I just said two men came to the Prophet ﷺ who were wearing white, but now here it specifically says who? The angel Jibreel alayhi salam, right? He says that the Prophet ﷺ was playing with his brothers, and then the men, when they came, they took him, فَصَرَعَهُ فَشَقَّ عَنْ قَلْبِهِ, and they cut him open, and they took out his heart, and they cut open his heart, فَاسْتَخْرَجَ قَلْبَهُ, and they extracted or removed his heart, and then فَاسْتَخْرَجَ مِنْهُ عَلَقَةً, and then they took like a small piece of flesh, and they said, هَذَا حَظُّ الشَّيْطَانِ مِنْكَ, and this is a portion or share of the shaitan that was in you, and he threw it away. ثم غسله في طست من ذهب بماء زمزم, and then they washed his heart in a golden basin, right, with Zamzam water, right? Then they returned it, and then his two brothers came racing to their mother, right? And they said to her that our brother, that Qurashi brother of ours, Muhammad, has been killed, right? Because they saw what happened and they said he's been killed. فاستقبلوه وهو منتقع لون. قال أنس وقد كنت أرى أثر ذلك المخيط في صدره. So then they came back to their mom. They said he's been killed. Then she came right away and then saw that the Prophet ﷺ, okay, he's fine, but his color had changed. Like when somebody's scared and they say, you know what I'm saying, you look like you look white, like you've seen a ghost or something. Prophet ﷺ, right, his color had changed. And then Anas, he comments saying that, and I saw on the Prophet ﷺ, meaning when he was an adult, he saw the scar or stitching, rather, from the scar from the stitching, right, that was on his chest, right? Anas ibn Malik, he said that, right, radiallahu anhu. And so, with regards to this issue about the splitting of the chest of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam, so it's mentioned by Al-Hafiz ibn Hajar al-Asqalani rahimahullah in his book Fath al-Bari, that the splitting of the chest of the Prophet ﷺ occurred 3 times. How many times, y'all? 3 times. So the first time would be what is mentioned right now in this hadith in Sahih Muslim and in other places, right? The second time they mentioned is that it happened just prior to the Prophet ﷺ receiving revelation, right? Out of honoring and preparation for him to receive revelation. That's the second time. A third time is mentioned that he received, again, that his chest was split open, his heart being cleansed. and then placed back in is when Isra wal Mi'raj, right? Because of the munajah, the communication and conversation that he's about to have with who? With Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So preparing him for that, right? It says that his chest was washed or cleansed again for the third time, excuse me. And there's even a fourth, that's mentioned by Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah in his book Zad al-Ma'ad. He mentions a fourth time when the Prophet ﷺ was 10 years old. But what is most commonly mentioned is 3 times, right? I'll tell you. So Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah, he mentions, and we're going to read here, the Prophet ﷺ was the most delightful person, and the benefit of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala cleansing and opening the chest of the Prophet ﷺ and cleansing his heart. Said his guidance, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, invited beneficence, truthfulness, and goodness. Based upon that, the Prophet ﷺ was the most delightful, wholesome, pleasant person. Indeed, truthfulness and doing acts of good had an amazing effect on easing the chest attachment to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him in opening his heart for prophethood, messengership, special characteristics, and abstracting the blood clot from him. So essentially, this was a means of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spiritually and divinely cultivating the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam and his manner and his character, right? To prepare him to be the man that he needed to be in order to invite people to Islam, to faith, to Iman, right? This is a part and parcel of the preparation, along with the other things that you'll see from the Sirah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So now, I'm gonna say time out. The salat. Did y'all move it to 7:30 yet? Still 7. Khalas. طيب. Khalas. So now we're talking about the passing of the mother of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So وبعد 6 مع شهر جاء وفاة أمه على الأبواء. So after 6 years and 1 month, his mother passed away in Al-Abwa, right? Excuse me. So the mother of the Prophet ﷺ died when he was how old, y'all? When he was 6 years old, right? When he was 6 years old and 1 month. So you want to try to remember, right? His father died before he was born. And now his mother died when he was 6, right? And then later on, you're going to add to that his grandfather and so on, right? But you want to try to remember this. So what happened, or how did the mother of the Prophet ﷺ pass? So she wanted to take the Prophet ﷺ, right, as a child, to visit his uncles, right, his maternal uncles, Banu Najab. And when we say maternal uncles, meaning uncles, right, like her siblings from his mother's side. They lived in Yathrib, or what we now know today as Medina. So he actually had relatives there, right? So she was taking them, keeping family ties to visit them. And when they were on their way back, so they're essentially pretty much like halfway between Medina and Mecca, pretty much like halfway in between. And she dies in an area that's known as Al-Abwa, right? And she got sick there, and she was sick for a few days, right? And then she passed away. And so she was buried there, right? And the Prophet ﷺ, he actually mentions later on, when he's prophet, he's with his companions, and they're on a trip. They're on a trip, and they're actually passing through that area, all right? It's mentioned, خرجت مع النبي صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم حتى إذا كنا بودان قال مكانكم حتى آتيكم فانطلق ثم جاءنا وهو ثقيل فقال إني أتيت قبر أم محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم فسألت ربي شفاعته فمنعنيها وإني كنت نهيتكم عن زيارة القبور فَزُورُوهَا. So the Prophet ﷺ, when they got to that area, he essentially told them, listen, I want y'all to stay here until I come back to you. And the Prophet ﷺ, he went off on his own. And then when he came back, he was essentially, you say, like heavy-hearted, right? He's like melancholy, he's down, right? And they noticed this. And in other narrations of this story, it mentions that the Prophet ﷺ, he was there, he was crying, right? And he started crying, and he didn't say anything. And the other companions around, they don't know why, they just see their beloved crying, so they all start crying, right? And then when the Prophet ﷺ is composed, right, he says that I came across my mother's grave, the grave Muhammad, right, the mother of Muhammad. He said, I came across her grave, and I asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right, to be able to make shafa'ah for her, meaning to intercede on her behalf, right? He said, فَمَنَعَنِيهَا, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not grant me this, that he is not allowed to intercede on behalf of his own mother, the Prophet ﷺ, right? He said, and I used to prevent you from and tell you, do not visit graves. He said, but now I am telling you, visit the graves, right? And the reason he says this, right? فَإِنَّهَا تُذَكِّرُ الْمَوْتِ, but now I'm telling you, go and go to the graves because they remind you of death. Go to the graves because they remind you of death. So there are a few different things that we take from this. Firstly, about making dua and asking for forgiveness, or even, for example, saying terms like rest in peace for non-Muslims. There is no peace after death for people who don't believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they pass and they die on that. People who do not believe in the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam after the advent of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we're not talking about people in the time of Isa alayhi salam or in the time of, right? But after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, those who do not believe both in Allah and Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there is no rest in peace after they die. Khalas. So my point, the reason why I'm mentioning this is that we are not allowed to make istighfar, to ask for, to pray for non-Muslims after they die. So Nelson Mandela, woman who was a journalist, she was like a journalist, I mean, in the trenches for like more than 20 years, right? When all other people from media forgot about the plight of the Palestinians, right? She's not Muslim, but she was in the trenches reporting, talking about, bringing light to the plight of the Palestinian people. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alleviate their difficulties and grant them victory. Allahumma ameen. And she was killed by an IDF soldier, by a sniper, right? She was killed by it, right? And subhanAllah, obviously, this is devastating for her family, right? Nobody should be happy about this. This is terrible, tragic. But then you had Muslims, right, praying for her. I even read a comment myself, and I'll keep it at this. They were like, if there is a paradise where she doesn't get to go, then I don't want to go there. That was one of the things that somebody said. I was like, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Like, how can you, right? Again, this is the dominion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He chooses who he wants to and who's not. That's for him to say who deserves to go there or not. Does that mean we're happy about that person being killed in such an ugly fashion? Does that mean we don't talk about it? No. Light should be shed on that issue, talked about. Those who perpetrated should be held to account, etc. But the red line where we have to stop as Muslims is making Allah yaghfir laha, Allahumma arhamha, Allahumma adkhilha al-jannah. That we cannot say. Y'all understand that? And this also becomes, right, on a practical level, for those who have non-Muslim relatives, aunties, uncles, grandmother, cousins, etc., or even those that you maybe just grew up with. We cannot make dua for them once they pass. But in light of that, then what should we do? To make da'wah to them now, while they're still alive, while you can. Inviting them to Islam, being a good example, etc. But this is a very, very important issue because it is a matter of aqeedah and creed, and it comes to an issue of al-wala wal-bara. And it's the same thing that happened to Ibrahim alayhi salam. Allah told him the same thing, right? You cannot make dua. Once it becomes clear, you can't. And the same thing told to Lut alayhi salam. Once it's made clear, don't even look at your wife. She's not your wife no more. Huh? Khalas. Nuh alayhi salam. Don't even look at your son no more. He says, I'm going to go on this mountain. Honey, la isma al-yawm. There's no safety there. Khalas. That's not your son. You can't. It's over. So for anybody, and that's the Anbiya wal Rusul. And here we have Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then you have the other issue of visiting the graves and the importance of visiting the graves per the recommendation and encouragement of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Some of those benefits, just some of. Number one, it gives us perspective. It has a way of realigning and shifting things for us. Those things that are temporary, we end up seeing that for what they really are. This is something temporary. Money is temporary. You can't take it with you to the akhirah, right? You can't take the dunya with you. And so then what is really priority? So it has a way of shifting your perspective and reordering your priorities to what is really important, i.e. whatever will help you when you go take that dirt nap and you're going to be all by yourself. Secondly, it reminds us that we're not going to live forever, that it's temporary. This life is temporary. And quite frankly, none of us know when we're going to punch our ticket. Nobody knows, which means what? Time becomes that much more valuable and important because it's finite. Matter of fact, that's like a general principle. Anything that is like limited in its quantity, right? It always raises in value. Why are diamonds so expensive when people want it so much? Because it's a limited source, right? I mean, along with all the other things, but it's limited. It's not like diamonds laying everywhere, right? It's something that, you know what I'm saying? Same thing with oil. Look at how much, right? The entire dunya is upended over this. Why? Because there's so many people and it's a limited amount. So you have governments who are willing to destroy whole nations over this limited resource. Y'all understand? Similarly, time is limited, which means what? We should be keen, diligent, and like protective and covetous, almost stingy when it comes to our time. Now, when I say stingy, I mean that you parcel it out where it needs to be and not waste your time. Or like some people say, we're just killing time. Now, and then lastly, it reminds us to prepare for the hereafter. So not simply death itself, but what is beyond. Visiting the graves reminds us about that. So now I know practically, logistically, right, for the most part, most janazas, they happen and it takes place, what, Burnsville, is it? Or Roseville? Burnsville and Roseville, right? Is that practical? Everybody, you going there every day, every other day, etc.? Maybe for some. And if you can't, mashallah. But I would say from time to time, you should make it a note from time to time that you should go. You should make it a note from time to time to be able to go for yourself. Not to catch up with people, what's going on, hey, how's it going, whatever. Matter of fact, I would even invite, like, avoid. And just be, so you can be there some solitude and just to reflect and to think, right? Because when you're looking at that 6x6 space, you have to remember that's where you're going to be. That's where I'm going to be. That's where my mom's going to be. That's where your cousin's going to be. That's where your uncle, like we all going there. What have we prepared for it? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us all prepared for that time. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it an easy passing, and may He protect us from the fitna and the trials of the grave. Ya Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. طيب أستاذ. Thank you. نعم وإياكم، أحسن إليكم إن شاء الله.